Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to my presentation. My name is Valentin Bogdan. I'm an associate professor of music at Mississippi University for Women, where I teach piano, music composition, music theory, and I'm also the president-elect of Mississippi Music Teachers Association, and I'm the former music composition chair for our organization. Obviously, music composition is a subject that is very near and dear to my heart, and I wanted to take the opportunity to offer this presentation to my colleagues and to their students in case they are interested in perhaps pursuing the study of music composition, but they might not know where to start. With no further ado, let's begin. Let's be creative, a short workshop on how to teach music composition to beginners. A couple of things to begin, to start with, things to keep in mind. This presentation caters to younger or beginner or beginning composition students. It's not necessarily a presentation that's going to be well suited for a experienced composition student, for example, for a college level composition student who has a certain background in this art form. But for a beginner or for a younger music student who might not have done this in the past, this is what I cater this composition for. A student should have prior musical experience. They should have performed some standard repertoire. Obviously, most of our students are pianists, but we also have singers, string players, etc. As long as they understand the concept of melody, harmony, and perhaps they have enough repertoire where they can relate to the idea of a musical form. They can remember, for example, a binary form, ternary form, maybe theme variations. This is a tonal approach to music composition. So this workshop will deal with writing a tonal piece. I did not want to get into things like atonality or 12 tone or any of the 20th century modern composition techniques, because I think that younger students, beginning composition students, will be more than likely to gravitate toward writing in a tonal idiom. And obviously, if the student becomes more advanced, if they show interest in this particular art form, we can also look at 20th century and contemporary techniques, manipulation of musical aspects to create a new musical work. So we have harmony, we have melody, we have form, we have rhythm, we have timbre, and then obviously many other elements within a musical piece. So obviously the very first choice is, what do you start with? Do you start with a chord progression? Do you start with a melody? Do you start with the form? Do you start with a rhythmic pattern to base that on? And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But really, the question is, why should anybody study music composition? Well, obviously, as we all know, we have many students who don't necessarily enjoy performing, but they like music, but perhaps they just don't have the personality to be on stage. They don't like being the center of attention. That makes them nervous. And we've also had, incredibly talented students who are not necessarily born performers, but they can be composers. They can still have something to say. They can still create and have their musical voice be heard. It also encourages creativity, where I like to call it the why in music. Why is a certain musical decision made by a great composer? Why did they choose to, write these particular pitches for a melody? Why are they choosing this chord? And then I think students, if once they study music composition, they're put themselves in the shoes of a composer. There's also a better understanding of the traditional repertoire on the part of the student. Once they study composition, they can look at some of the forms and sort of understand how they'll come together. And then obviously they will make them better performers. And then also challenges students to think outside the comfort of their own instrument, which can also make them better musicians. And what I mean by that is, quite often composers write for instruments that are not their own. I myself am a pianist. I play a couple of instruments, but I have to write pieces for orchestras. I've had to write pieces for brass instruments, which I don't really play. So I had to educate myself to what's possible and what isn't in those particular for those particular instruments. I had to give myself some lessons on YouTube, or talk to various performers and collaborate with them and say, okay, can this be done by your instrument? Is this easy to do? Is this feasible? So it really opened up a greater opportunity for me to educate myself, and we do the same for our students. And also, let's keep in mind that most famous performers of the past were also composers. So why not today? Since when do we become so specialized that a pianist cannot be a composer, or a violinist cannot be a composer? I think that's perfectly suited. You know, a composer is not necessarily someone who knows more than a performer. They just choose to write. They choose to put themselves out there and compose. So I think if we encourage our students who are performers to do that as well, it will only help them grow. Some myths that need to be debunked as far as composition is concerned. First myth that I heard all the time is the composition comes naturally to the chosen ones, thus it cannot be taught. And that's simply not true. Perhaps it is partly true, the first part of the sentence. Of course, a composer of great talent things will come easier to them, but nonetheless, they still have to think, they still have to make intellectual decisions, and they still need a teacher, or they need it at some point in their life, to introduce them to various technique and compositional methods. Another myth is that all good music has been composed already, right? We've all heard that, especially by some of our more conservative colleagues in the performance field. You know, that's not really true. There's Stravinsky, there's Debussy, there's Ives, there's many contemporary composers as well who have written great piano pieces, or just great pieces in general. So we still have a lot of good music that we can write, is the point of all this. Another myth is the composition is difficult to teach. How can one teach a student to be creative? Well, you can't necessarily do that. The student has to do that themselves, but you can encourage the student and you can guide them into certain directions. And I think teaching composition is very different than teaching applied, any type of applied instrument, because we don't have something to fall back on, such as the musical score. But what we can do is we can ask some questions and give some suggestions and push the student towards certain choices that they have to make, and then eventually they have to make them. So I think that's what a composition teacher's main job is. And the last myth is that modern music is ugly, it's too dissonant, there's no melody, etc. And of course, that's not true. I like modern music a lot, but I can understand how a younger composer, they might be taken aback by this. However, we have to keep in mind that they don't necessarily have to write in the modern idiom. Anything goes in the current century. We have plenty of very successful composers who are tonal composers. We have folks who write music in a traditional style, and they're very successful. And then, of course, we have the modern composers, the academic composers. The number one challenge that I give to my students is that they have to be sincere, that they have to write whatever they feel, and they have to stay true to themselves. So, there's a systematic approach of teaching the beginner composer. Where do we start? Do we start with harmony? We start with melody, with form, with timbre, or the register, or with the rhythm. We can start anywhere. But what I find it the most useful for beginner composers is to start with the form. And there are a number of reasons why that is. First of all, if we're looking, if we go back and think about who this presentation is the best suited for, are the students who have some experience, so they would be familiar with some of these forms, at least a binary form or a ternary form. So there's something that they can lean back on as far as this idea is concerned. Also, what the form does, it gives you, as the teacher, an opportunity to streamline the information and make sure that the student is focused. Musical ideas don't wander away. I always think of complexity by the way of simplicity. So you start with one idea, with one sort of track, with one path, and then don't necessarily move off that path until you've created something. So a student can start with, saying, okay, I'm going to write something in a binary form. Well, they have to be in a binary form. So that means that there's certain number of phrases that they can write. There's a certain number of conditions that must be met in order for this to be a binary form piece. So these particular conditions will allow the student to stay focused on the task and also give them a sense of completion. One thing to keep in mind is that the music theory definitions are less important, especially for younger students who might not have studied music theory. So instead of, the A section versus B section, we can just refer to section one or part one versus part two. Um, for formula, we can point out the contrast between the sections by using the terms appropriate to students' current level. You can say happy versus sad, mellow versus energetic, etc., depending how advanced the student is. One thing that I've noticed it works very well is drawing a map of a musical piece, which can be used as an inspiration for a student's work, such as this. So let's take a look at the bagatelle. The map here, the melodic contour that goes up and then down and up, and it's mapped up in this particular chart. And then, so, this map can serve sort of as an idea for the student. If they get stuck, if they're trying to look for some ideas, they can go back to this map and say, all right, the melody is going up in this bagatelle. I'm going to do something similar. Then it's going down. And then obviously they don't have to stick with the map, but it's something to lean back on if they run out of idea. Um, a lack of idea, lack of inspiration is something that we as composers always have to deal with. So there's, techniques that we need to um, apply in order to get ourselves out of uh, writer's block, so to speak. And what I notice for students, this, a mapped out version of their piece might be, or is a useful tool. So how do you start the thematic material? How do you build a melody? Well, my number one piece of advice is to start with a single line instrument in order to avoid discussion of harmonies, chord progressions in the very beginning. So, once we've established the form, obviously that's number one thing. So let's say we're going to write a binary form piece. Choose a key and then ask the student to write down a scale. Obviously, we're going to deal with tonal music. So, most of the pitches that we're going to use are going to be part of the pitch set. So if it's C major, you write a C major. If it's G major, etc. And then one thing that I like to do is start with the rhythm, decide on a rhythmic pattern that can in turn become the motif. Now, this depends on the student. A student, if they improvise a lot on the piano, if they're more advanced on their instrument, they might be able to just sit down and then play some motif already. But if there's somebody who maybe they're more shy as far as this their composition approach is concerned, I would simply start with a rhythmic pattern and then build that from there. So I'll give you an example. A very simple rhythmic pattern, let's say a 2-bar, let's say we're in 4/4, and I'm just gonna go, right? So I just played obviously is quarter note, 2/8 notes, quarter note, quarter note, quarter note, and half note. So it's 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. It would be useful to help the student write this down. It's a great ear training exercise. This is a de facto rhythmic dictation, right? And every good musician needs to have strong ear training skills. If they know how to do this, they can write it down. If not, we can help them and then work on them so they can build up the skill. It's not a very hard skill to acquire, the rhythmic dictation. But then after that, they can just simply decide on what pitches to use from the scale. So let's say if I'm using G major, then I can simply go, I can do something as simple as a scale. It's larger than a typical motif, but since I've decided I'm going to go with this rhythmic pattern, I feel like I need to fill it out to its entirety with pitches. Perhaps this, it becomes a trial and error. Do I like this, or does my student like this? Should I say, It's important that the student does all this, that we help, but we don't just play things for them and say, okay, pick and choose it. It's They should be the one who decide. Do I like this? Perhaps not. We can try some other things. We can try a chord. Okay, this is a little bit as simplistic as the scale. How about we add some filler notes in between the chord tones, right? So in this particular case, it will be a great opportunity to discuss the notes that are more important and versus less important within our scale, right? So the more important notes are the tonic, the third, the fifth, and create the tonic triad. The less stable notes are the 2 and the 4, maybe the 6 scale degree, obviously the leading tone. So you can, figure out, okay, how about this could be a pattern, right? How about if we end up on a note that is one of the less stable ones? What happens then? Right? There's a different decision that should be made after if my motif, if my or if my little phrase ends here, versus if I do, or versus if I do. Right? But all of these are acceptable solutions. So if the student sits down and experiments, they also work on their ear training because they're able to write all this down. And remember how, or keep in mind that how I kept my rhythmic pattern the same. All I did was fill it with different notes. After that, if the student is stuck, right? Let's say they cannot come up with anything else, they can always go back and look at the piece that they're currently studying and say, okay, how about I just borrow a phrase from my piece or the opening or something like this, just to get things going. So that is an option as well. What happens after, right? It's great to start, but what happens in measure 3? What happens in measure 4, 5, 6, etc., etc., etc.? Well, I always encourage my students to commit to building a complete musical phrase. It should have a beginning, it should have a peak, a high point, and it should have an end. Now, of course, the end could be the high point, or the high point could be somewhere else within the phrase, but nonetheless, they must think of the greater picture and not just the two bar motif or the 2 bar subphrase that they have started. So the question is, where's the opening going? Where's the opening motif going? We can use the map, right? So if I go back to my idea, in the original map, if we go back, we know that in the second part of the phrase, there's going to be a descending motion. So perhaps we can do something like this. Or we can do something very inexpensive and repeat the same motif. And then have it develop from there. If this becomes too boring, we can explore different pitch combinations. We can go ahead and transpose the motif, or something like this, or transpose then change it a little bit like I just did. One can go against the map. So for example, if the map is descending, they can do the complete opposite. One thing that we should keep in mind is going back to the idea of committing to building the complete musical phrase. We should always encourage the student to have a peak of that particular phrase. So there should be motion towards something. There should be a need for resolution. There should be some tension. And we should also explain the concept of cadences, not necessarily as a music theory, harmonically, because maybe students don't know what a 5-1 is, or a 5-6 is, or a 4-1 is. But we should just explain them as rather as pauses, as as arrival points, as moments of repause. We can have a comparison with punctuation marks, period versus comma, if appropriate, right? A cadence that is final sounds more like a period, like the phrase is ended. A cadence that is not final, that needs resolution, it's more like a comma. We know we expect something to follow it. So cadences are very important because they do serve as the ending of phrases. What else can we do in order to make this more interesting? Well, we can truncate the motive, right? Use the first half. So my phrase was, so I'm just going to use this opening and it becomes its own motive, so to speak. So on and so forth. We can use rhythmic diminution or augmentation. This really helps quite a bit to create the motion that we need. To have 60 notes or eight, or obviously start with 8 notes, maybe 60 notes. So there's sort of like this idea of a forward push towards a high point within every phrase. Use variations of the motif, such as the inversion, the retrograde, or the retrograde inversion. We can switch registers. Here's my original one. How about? Or something like this, where I take some of those notes from my original motif, maybe the third or the fourth time it appears, and change their and just transpose them by an octave, either high or low. So it creates a certain familiarity in the ears of an audience, but they realize it is not exact carbon copy. And then one thing that we really have to do is make a list of some of these options in case there is a need to use some of them later. And of course, returning to the form, we can also discuss the second section or the B part. And in the eyes of a student, we can simply just ask them whatever it is you did in the first section. Maybe think contrast, think the opposite. You can use a different scale, could be closely related or not, perhaps closely related, since we're trying to maintain a certain congruency with their traditional pieces that they've learned in piano or other instruments. They can use a different motif, different note values, could be a slower, faster tempo, change registers, change the rhythmic patterns, reinforce the concept of phrases, again, and then discuss cadences again. And then, if stuck, ask the student to look at some of the pieces they are currently studying for additional inspiration. And then, obviously, if we're writing for a piece for piano, which I think most beginning students will want to do that because it's what they're comfortable with. We also have to talk about harmony. We can talk about starting with harmonic rhythm. How do you choose the accompaniment to the melody that we've just discussed? Should we harmonize every note, kind of like in the Bach chorale type of deal? It's not a good idea. Each measure is a better idea. We can have a variation on the above, 2 chords per measure, perhaps, but it all depends on students. Obviously, they can also add rests. They can do some additional things where it doesn't necessarily have to always be a left hand has to be present there. But ask the student to choose the harmonic language based on the melody notes. What melody notes do they think are important? And remember that we're working with a tonal piece. And again, it gets me back to the idea of good ear training skills. This will really develop their ear training skills because they'll be able, even if they don't know, theory right now, they'll be able to see that this particular chord does not fit this pitch. If nothing else, I'm going to try and play it and see that it doesn't match. And then, deciding on accompaniment pattern, we can ask the student to revisit some of their piano pieces and look at the accompanying patterns featured there. We have obviously the wild style. We have what I would like to call the oompa style, where it's. We have Alberti bass with its variations. Right, and then we can have any type of similar variation of the Alberti bass, like this technically not Alberti bass, but we can have just a chord that we roll up. Even something as simple as repeated block chords, like we have in the Bagatelle by Diabelli. Anything to get the students started, and then after that, it can become more complex. Some things to consider how deeply should one delve into discussion of music theory, such as voice leading, parallelism, leading tone resolutions, etc. I wouldn't do much of that simply because that's not the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise is to get the student to write. I think it's important not to get bogged down in definitions because you do not want to squash the creativity of the student, especially the beginner who's might be even shy and maybe they don't feel great about trying to compose in the first place. A phrase structure, I think, should be covered at some point in the future. Musical sentence or parallel and contrasting periods, simply because it will offer greater consistency within every musical phrase and will offer a nice opportunity for the student to learn about these structures and use them, knowing that there are certain conditions that they must obey for them to write a musical a sentence or to write a period will also allow them to be more focused on what they need to do. And then the questions of where's my phrase going, how do I end this phrase, that becomes eliminated by the fact that you simply have to stay within the structure of the phrase, whatever phrase you choose. How much should the teacher influence the student's aesthetic choices? It depends on the student's experience. If the student is a beginner, perhaps the teacher needs to be more involved. If the student, shows promise and they're creative and they're not shy, a teacher can simply have a back seat and just guide as opposed to influence in a stronger manner. I like to direct my students a certain way, such as I like this idea, maybe you should use this more. Always, I always try to figure out something that they've written that I like and ask them to expand on it, to develop on it. Students who are stuck, students who are less experienced, we can give some choices, but not necessarily tell them what to do because composition is personal. And if I tell them what to do, then they won't be able to make decisions on their own. And I think it's okay to help students in issues such as notation, especially if they're young. But I do encourage students to start writing their own ideas on paper, simply because it really develops their ear training skills as well. Melodic dictation, which we all know, it's a difficult task even for college students. A composition student will be way better at that if they start doing it at an early age because they would have the experience and they would be forced to put their thoughts on paper. Conclusion: in my opinion, music composition is a very attainable activity. It doesn't require a genius ranking on the music intelligence scale. It requires somebody to have a bit of courage and some guidance from the part of a teacher. My suggestion is to begin with simple concepts to try to relate them to music the student already plays. So always have a comparison to works that a student is currently playing. If the piano teacher is also the composition teacher, that is very easy to do. But even if they're not, they can always ask the student, oh, what kind of pieces do you play? Do you play sonata? Do you play theme and variations? All right, well, look at the piece that you're currently playing and see if you can't take some elements from that to what you're working on in your composition. And then, very important, encourage students to listen to a variety of classical composers. And they could have, they could be from standard rap, they could be modern, and also look at their musical scores. It's very important not just to listen to it, but see it on paper, and then have them make lists of what they liked and what they could use on each work that they've listened to and they have examined, because it's always important to build their toolboxes as a composers, and you build this by looking at what other people have done in the past. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. And I do want to say that it's been a pleasure giving this talk to you today. I hope you will encourage your students to compose. I think music composition is an incredible, rewarding activity. We have a wonderful music composition program at MUW, and our student composers have won competitions, have had music performed all over the United States, have had readings by the Mississippi Symphony. And if they hadn't been composition students, they would have not had these opportunities. So it really opens up a great new world for any students. And if nothing else, they would be working on becoming more creative, which is always a wonderful skill to have, not just for the musicians, but for really anybody. So please feel free to email me if you have any questions. And please check out my website, valentinbogdan.com. Have a great rest of the day, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you for your time.